say, let's get started in this. You can see, you folks have the agenda up, so you can see that right now, and you can all hear me.
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to say is, first off, good afternoon to everybody. This is 2 WebEx meetings in 1 week, so thank you all for being able to participate today. For anybody listening or wasn't involved in putting this together, this session is a follow-up from our executive session that we had on July 22nd, where we discussed board roles, relationships, and communications related to how we, as TriMet board members, can create or could unintentionally create uncomfortable or unanticipated reactions if our roles or responsibilities aren't clear as board members. And oftentimes also members of the community are confused and misunderstood if that happens. So at the end of that session, it was agreed, I just went back and looked at kind of what things we talked about. We all said as new board members come on this board, we have a responsibility to ensure that we do as much as possible with important education and to provide as much information as needed to ensure that all board members have clarity on how best to move forward as the board makes its decisions and tackles the issues that we have to confront with on a regular basis. We also talked about the need for stronger training and ways to communicate about what could be perceived as lobbying contrary to board approved policy. We also discussed that the board believed it important to have today's conversation given the issues that the board continues to face, especially around our desires for safety, security, and equity, but also keeping in mind what's happening throughout the nation right now. And we're dealing with that, again, it seems like a daily basis. We also realize that there are many different viewpoints from people in our districts and those who reach out to board members individually and collectively. And we noted the need for training and conversation around our purview and our role as board members to better serve the public. And I think the most important thing that I got out of that executive session, I think we all felt the need to just have discussions around governance and how to work to maintain and build trust, which I think is really the primary objective of the day's session, just again, how we work together and how we make sure that we do it as effectively as possible. So as a result of that discussion, with the help of our general counsel, Shelley Devine, we have a group of folks who are taking time to help us in this area and to learn from their experience as board members, staff, or consultants with other transit districts throughout the United States. She went right to David Bragdon, the executive director of Transit Center, who then worked with us to enlist the help of 3 other great resources, who I think are all on board right now, to help us in our quest. And I want you to know that I've had a lot of time working with David Bragdon while at Metro. And as you read from his biography, he has a long and interesting background. And I also know that Kimberly has posted copies of today's presentations for your information, although I think they'll be presented by put up on the screen by the presenters. So I understand that 3 of us have also taken advantage of the training provided by Transit Center. So I would just say that David is very qualified to give us great advice and counsel, and that he knows this region and TriMet very well. And most importantly, he's agreed to help us. So unless any of you board members have anything to add to what I just said, or I didn't capture our desires from our executive session, and I'll just stop for a minute to make sure there's nothing else that the board members wanted to say here in terms of kicking us off. I'm seeing no hands up for nobody talking. So with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Mr. Bragdon, if that's all right with you, David.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks very much. I think Jeff will let me share my screen. I'm really pleased to sort of be in Portland today, and on behalf of 2 of the 3 other presenters actually are my board members, and so the 2 of them are my bosses. So let me first tell you a little bit about ourselves at Transit Center and kind of what it is that we do. So How is that? Does everybody see a familiar scene there? It's familiar to me, even from 3,000 miles away. Is that, are you seeing a
We're seeing it.
familiar scene of downtown Portland? So this is actually, I'm not just using this for you. I use this in presentations all over the country. Just to introduce us, Transit Center, we're a civic foundation. So we're a nonprofit public interest organization. We're not a consulting firm. We have nothing to sell you or persuade you. Well, we do have things to persuade you of. Our goal is really to improve public transit in this country. And not for its own sake. Many of us are transit fans and like transit for its own sake, but organizationally, we see transit as instrumental to better cities. In particular, transit is very important given the times that Bruce referenced, not just the times that we're in right now, but generally the challenges facing our country. Transit is incredibly important to the major issues that are facing us. One, growing inequality across our country, the need for racial justice, and the challenges of climate change. And transit is really key to both of those things. There's a clear correlation between physical access, mobility and access, and socioeconomic mobility. And so much of our transportation infrastructure over the years, predominantly the highway system, really has been a tool of racism in terms of where highways have been located, in terms of communities that have been harmed by transportation. And the inability to get around is a huge, huge check on people's ambitions and ability to participate in the economy or get to other places. That's been even more true, obviously, during the pandemic. About a third of transit riders generally are in the job census categories called essential. That's a third on a normal day. Now they're about 100% of transit ridership. And so the importance of serving that and reducing auto dependence in terms of what auto dependence costs a household. If you're a lower income household and you're spending $8,000 to $12,000 a year on a car, and a huge burden. So in so many ways, transportation does need to address and can be a very effective way of addressing racial justice issues. The second, of course, climate change. I was out in Oregon 3 weeks ago. You're on the front lines. The forest fires obviously have a climate relationship. The biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country, of course, is transportation, primarily automobiles. And you cannot address climate change without significantly reducing auto dependence. And that means increasing transit ridership. And I'll keep coming back to this ridership point. It's all about the need to increase ridership if you're really going to make a difference between on both equity and in terms of the environment. So while we use this picture as kind of an ideal, the actual reality in most of the United States is pretty far from that ideal. We use this picture because this is really who we're working for and working with, and types of people whose voices we're trying to amplify, the riders. This is Atlanta, but it really could be just about anywhere. It could be someplace in the Portland region. No sidewalk, no shelter. The bus probably doesn't run very frequently. Streets entirely devised for cars, designed for cars. But we don't see this primarily as a design issue. Designs exist. Engineers can build sidewalks. Engineers can build streets that make sense for people. It's not a lack of technology, and it's often not a lack of money. It's a lack of power. And this really is about political power and empowering transit riders. And that is why we think boards are so important. We really hit on this idea I hit on this idea over dinner with Christoph Spieler, who you're going to hear from in a minute. And we were in Houston talking about what he had done as a board member of the Houston Metro system to really improve that system. And so we have found in our studies of the field that often transit agency boards have a ton of untapped potential. They have all kinds of community connections, roots in the community, and insights that often are not taken advantage of. And the role isn't often understood. They're often obscure, don't have consistent norms and processes, and there's some unaccountability in some jurisdictions. It's a real mismatch across the country, but that's why we started this program, to really work on developing leadership potential for transit agency board members. Really happy that Keith and Ozzie and Linda participated in our programs in the past. A little bit more about sort of where we start, where we're coming from. We really put riders first. It really starts with understanding what it is that riders want and need. We carry out our work through applied research, which includes these rider surveys, technical assistance like we're doing today, or events around that. We have a very active blog and opinions and a range of publications. We do grant-making support to community-based organizations, and Fred is going to talk about one of our grantees, Ride New Orleans, community-based pro-transit organization. There's a similar organization in Houston called Houston Link, and Christoph is involved with that. You can find our work at transitcenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. With regard to this particular foundational work on Who's on Board, which is a survey we do every 2 or 3 years of riders, it just keeps coming back to the fundamentals. It's the basics of frequency, reliability, overall trip length, the idea of service that runs into the evenings and late night and weekends, and having the ability to take a number of different types of trips, not just the 9 to 5 conventional way we think about transit, but that those are the fundamentals that we always stress agencies should be focusing on, frequency and reliability. We find sometimes a lot of the things that get attention actually don't show up on rider concern surveys. There's often a lot of attention around an issue about free fares. Well, actually, you know, the biggest obstacle to people using transit is not the price, and they say that themselves. It's the lack of service. And the lack of service is, in fact, the biggest obstacle. We've also, the speed and reliability issue, street design, big issue there, bus lanes. We really applaud Portland and TriMet and the Rose Lanes project, and saving a few minutes here and there, tremendous ridership gains that we've seen anywhere that's been tried. So that's just a little bit of sort of our fundamentals. That's the extent I'm really going to talk about transit today, because today's not really about transit, it's about the board. So just to tell you a little bit about who we are. Now, for those who I don't know yet, a little bit about me, because I moved from Portland to New York 10 years ago this month. It's been a fast decade since I lived in Portland, but in the prior 40 years, I lived almost entirely in Portland. I'm an old friend of TriMet. My first engagement with TriMet was in 7th grade, when I discovered the freedom that I had as a 7th grader in Southeast Portland, that I could get downtown on my own without asking anybody to drive me. I could go to VMAX Sandwich Shop or the Music Millennium. I could go to the Hostess Coffee Shop, if you remember that place. It's where Nordstrom is now. That I could do all that and have that type of freedom, and the freedom that transit brings to me. And I've been hooked on it ever since. And I was followed then TriMet. I testified. This is probably the first time I've spoken officially to a TriMet board in about 40 years, but I used to do it quite a bit. In fact, I wrote Governor McCall a letter when I was 15 and asked him to appoint me to the TriMet board. This is actually the truth. He wrote me back a nice letter that I still have someplace, declining to appoint me, but saying, don't let this discourage you. Don't let this discourage you. Keep your interest in going. And so I did. I kept staying interested in transit. I was actually an intern, a paid intern at TriMet in the summer of 1974, wrote a manual. They printed up 20,000 copies. It was the first guide to transit in Portland that they distributed. And then 20 years later, taking heed from Governor McCall, I ran for office, and transit was a big part of my platform. Other people use their pictures with school children or parks or something in their brochure. I had Max Light Rail in the back of my photo in the brochure. Ran for office, served nearly 12 years on the Metro Council. That's where Bruce and I first met. First met Bruce in December of 1998 on a bus trip to Arlington, Oregon, to the landfill. We were watching the trains in the gorge. Bruce may remember that. And as you know, Metro Council works very closely with TriMet, all the modeling, all the environmental impact statements, all the federal funding, all of that coming through Metro Council. And so a long association between those two organizations. The real point, though, in terms of the Metro experience, I really want to stress today is that the Metro Council is like the TriMet board in the sense that it structurally is very similar, in that the Metro Council is a policy setting board, is a legislative body that delegates day-to-day management to a chief operating officer. And we're going to keep coming back to that point, the idea of a board setting policy and management managing. That is exactly how the Metro Council is structured, and that's how TriMet is structured. That's how many governmental organizations are structured. So really our emphasis today, again, not on transit. We're happy to do another event about transit. We'll talk about buses another time. Our agenda today is really not technical details, about board norms and how it works in other places. And I'm really excited to be able to bring two of my board members and a third person that we work with who are your peers in other parts of the country to talk about how they do it. We'll kind of talk about role of the chair, the dynamics among board members. We're going to have an encouraged conversation among you on that, the relationship between the board and management, and then what it's like when you're outside the organization and speaking outside. So when you're first appointed, I'm sure they throw all kinds of numbers at you. I mean, and there's a lot to learn. And my first thought is, you really don't need to memorize all these things as a board member. I'm going to tell you the one number you need to memorize. There's some interesting ones here, but let me give you a different way of thinking about them. 1.53 billion. You might recognize that. That was your most recent adopted budget that I saw on your website. And you don't need to memorize every bit of that. You have a finance committee, you have a CFO. You need to make sure that that's an expression of priorities. That's really what that is. Now, 21, I mean, 21 is a good number too. You can drink in Oregon if 21, but it's just here because that's actually, it's line number 21 that runs between Gresham and Parkrose. Now, and you don't need to know, you don't need to memorize that as a board member. Christoph, who you're going to hear from in a minute, he's a transit savant, and he would know that. He probably knows where the 21 runs, even though he doesn't even live in Portland. But really, what you need to know is it's serving Gresham and Parkrose. And what you need to know is, well, Gresham and Parkrose, those are two really good places where there's travel demand, and are we adequately serving it? But whether it runs on 223rd or runs on Halsey or runs on Sandy, I mean, let the professionals figure out the actual technical details of how that works. 310,000, that of course, that's on a normal pre-pandemic day, that's how many people you're serving. That's a good number to keep in mind. I think that's a good thing to think about, as that's who we're serving. That's the constituency that, you come from a particular district, or that you come with an appointment from the governor, but you're not serving the governor anymore. You're not serving just a district, you're serving those 310,000 people. And I would also think about it in terms of segmenting that, like, who are they? What do they need? What are they telling you in surveys? What are their travel demands? And it's not so much the number, it's the quality of it. 5307, another number you don't need to know. It's the Urbanized Area Formula Funds. It's part of federal law. You have government relations staff to do that, to know that. What you need to know about federal policy is that you're going to be helpful in talking to Senator Merkley, talking to Senator Wyden, that you as directors have other community connections. So when Ron Wyden looks at Travis, he doesn't just see TriMet. He says, well, this guy's also connected to the Gresham Chamber of Commerce. When he sees Keith, he says, well, this is Keith. I've known Keith a long time. If he's saying something on behalf of TriMet, I'm going to listen. And I know Keith from his days in the labor movement. So again, you don't need to know the intricacies. Trust your staff on the intricacies of federal policy. You play at the high level. You play at the official level to the officials. 16%, that's the percentage of your budget that comes, or your revenue, rather, your budget, the percentage of your revenue that comes from fares. It's a good number to know when people start talking about, well, let's not have fares. Well, then a reasonable question is, well, where are we going to get 16% of the money? Without 16% of the revenue, you're going to cut costs. And boards make trade-offs. You can't just deal in sound bites of things that sound good. You really think about those fiscal consequences. 688, that's the number of buses that you had in the last National Transit Database. Again, you don't need to memorize that, because it's going to be out of date in 6 months. And moreover, that's just talking about yourself and your own attributes. Really, the issues you should be thinking about is how many people, what's the percentage of the people in your region that have access on a 5-minute walk to a frequent bus line that runs every 5 minutes? Then let your staff figure out how many buses does it take to do that. Actually, a metric that Seattle uses, King County Metro uses. And it's about them. It's about the people being served, not about us. Have you ever seen a UPS ad or a FedEx ad where they've told you how many planes they have? No, they don't. And you don't care how many planes they have. What do they tell you? They tell you, you give us a package by 4 o'clock here, we'll deliver across the country at 9 a.m. You don't really care about their equipment. You care about what they're doing for you. GASB 68, again, it's like, that's an interesting number. And it's an accounting term. Well, what you need to know, not being accountants, is do you have a good auditor and do you trust them? That's all you need to know. And then 23 compared to 15. Well, 23 minutes is how long it takes to get from Milwaukee to Oregon City on the bus. 15 minutes is how long it takes to do it in a car. Again, not numbers to memorize, but it might provoke the question, why does it take 53 minutes, 53% longer to go by bus? And let's do something about speeds everywhere. So again, I think trying to get you thinking just beyond sort of the detail or micromanagement of particular figures, and really think about what those figures mean in terms of people. Now, there is one number that you do need to memorize. And this is the number that every Metro counselor, if they're successful, memorizes and always has in mind. And if you just memorize this, the number is 4. And the number is 4 because there are 7 of you, and 4 is a majority. So 4 is the number that you need to make policy. 4 is the minimum of number you need to give direction to staff. 4 is the number you need to adopt or to amend a budget. 4 is the minimum number that you need to actually make a difference in terms of being on the board. Now, individuals do matter. Individuals matter a whole lot. And Christoph and Amanda and Fred, as individuals, are leaders on their board. They matter a whole lot. They have a whole lot of influence as individuals, but their individuals' influence starts with their peers, by influencing their peers. And that is exactly how it was on the Metro Council as well. An individual can't really carry anything out. Individual can have great ideas, but unless there's 3 other members who agree, then it doesn't get carried out. So let's go on now to the sort of those internal dynamics. I said I would talk just briefly about the role of the chair, or in case your case or Metro Council's case, it's the president. I benefited a lot from a good mentor, Senator Mark Hatfield. We could also say without him, we would not have light rail to Gresham. Without him, therefore, we probably wouldn't have light rail to Hillsborough or anywhere else either. OHSU would be a couple of buildings up on the hill with maybe a fluorescent light bulb. The Columbia River Channel would be 35 feet instead of the 43 feet that it is. A lot of things to thank Senator Hatfield for. But what I thank him for, shortly after I became president of the Metro Council, he was retired. He came over to me at an event at Portland State University, very soft, and shook hands and said, congratulations. He was following this stuff, even in retirement. Something I thought was relatively obscure, and that he would come over and talk to somebody in my position. I was really flattered. He very softly said, congratulations, but remember, sometimes you have to show them who the chair is. Wow, what is this? I mean, here's this dignified, pacifist, the least bombastic person you've ever imagined in the U.S. Senate, and he's got this iron backbone of saying, sounds like, throw your weight around or something. And that's not actually what he meant. What he meant was, you have a couple of tools that are official. You're running the meetings and you have Robert's rules, but those are resources, is really what he said. Those are things you have to show that you can run a meeting and that you can keep things going, but that it's also really about the relationships. And I took Senator Hatfield's advice, and I had sort of I was in the council presidency for nearly 8 years, and had sort of a set of operating guidelines that I had in my head and that I actually shared with my colleagues at the time. And said, here's the deal. Okay, so I am a firm and fair steward of the process. That means we keep things going and set an agenda, keep it tight. That means, like, sometimes we're going to get to a point where we cut things off, but it's been fair. Everybody's had a say. My old colleague, Carl Hostica, on the bias, he would whisper to me once in a while. He would say, I think we're at the stage where everything has been said, but not everybody has said it, but we don't need to hear it anymore. Nobody likes stoplights necessarily themselves, but we all abide by them because they are fair for the whole group. And so that was part of my understanding, was that the parliamentary chair has a lot of power, but it's the best power. It's the power you don't necessarily use. It's just there to keep the group moving and keep things going. And another expectation I had, and nobody ever violated this, was just no surprises. I said to everybody got elected, whenever they joined the council, I said, look, the deal. I'll never use procedure against you to cut you off. If you can't get a second, I'll even put the gavel aside and second it for discussion myself. I'll never use process against you, but in return, you don't surprise me. Come to me when you want something. I'll put it on the agenda, but don't surprise me in the meeting. And that always really worked. That led to a set of sort of understandings that we had as counselors. And again, 7-member body, a lot of similarities here. Some of these were things that were explicit that we understood. Others were things that we just caught on to pretty quickly. The key one was that each is an individual. We all went there because we were elected. In our case, you're appointed, but we were all there because we had points of view. We had knowledge. We had life experience. We had things we wanted to do. We had constituencies that had helped put us there. They'd voted for us. Ideally, we had individual judgment. And, you know, if the world wanted unanimity on a board, well, you wouldn't have a board at all. You'd just get 7 robots. So none of the point of this is to have 7-0 votes. I think 7-0 votes are actually sometimes not a good sign. But debate is good. Diversity is good. Reasoning things through is really good. And so that's why we have boards with a diversity of people on them. It's additive. But at the very same time, every Metro councilor was always acutely aware that you're simultaneously, while being an individual with those individual ideas and background and history, you are also a member of a collective. You're also a member of a governing body that's responsible jointly for an agency. And you really have to do both of those things successfully, simultaneously, to actually get anything accomplished. And it just came down to some very pragmatic terms. One is it takes 3 others. This goes back to that number 4. It takes 3 others to get anything done. And as a practical matter, if you're going to win over 3 people, it stands to reason it's actually a lot easier to do that if you have good credibility and ongoing relationships with all 6. Because you know, if you only have 3, there's no margin of error there. You're totally dependent on everybody. So maintaining those relationships, and particularly the interchange that happens informally between meetings and communications, credibility, really important. And the other thing that we kept reminding ourselves of, and we had witnessed from afar, the Multnomah County Commission meltdowns in the late 90s and early 2000s, where spats in public that became personal were really to nobody's benefit. Some people were under the mistaken impression that, well, if I get the better of somebody at this meeting, or I'm a more witty, or I have a better snappy comeback at that meeting, I'm going to succeed at that person's expense. And that's just not how it works with the public. It's a group grade. And we knew that if the Metro Council got bogged down, it's not like, oh, I'm going to look good, or Robert or Carl's going to look bad. It's like we're all in the end going to look bad. And so maintaining credibility was really important. The group grade, again, that collective responsibility for decorum and consistency and mutual respect. So then finally, the relationship with management. And here, the Metro Council is very much like TriMet in having a board that sets policy, including the budget, and oversees the agency, and management that manages. That's just that simple. In the case of Metro, I hired Mike Jordan, who had been city manager in Canby, who understood the relationship between city council of Canby, city manager of Canby. He had then been an elected official on the Clackamas County Commission, so he understood that side of it too, how the commissioners relate to the county administrator in that case. It's currently over there is Marissa Madrigal, who had a similar role as a COO at Multnomah County, but had also temporarily was on the commission. So very clear distinction between our roles, and the management role to run the agency, including all personnel and day-to-day operating matters, whereas the council is at the high level, and their only role in personnel is hiring that chief operating officer. I once ran into a friend who had just been elected to the Portland School Board, another organization in the past that had some personnel problem. I said, hey, how's it going on the school board? She said, oh, it's so demanding. I'm spending 40 hours a week on school board business. And I said, well, gee whiz, I hate to break this to you, but if you're spending 40 hours a week as a school board member, either you're doing the job wrong or your management's doing it wrong. Because being on the school board should not be a 40-hour-a-week job. You're either micromanaging or you're doing stuff that management is failing to do and you're doing in their behalf. So I think that's something good to keep in mind, that you are a part-time board and in terms of your role. What does that mean to you? I was surprised, for example, we'll get into a little detail here, but on the discussion of light rail stops in downtown Portland, I'm not sure why a board, frankly, if I were on the board, why I'd want to be in that type of discussion. It's a technical operational decision. There are international standards and criteria for how far apart stops should be. You have goals for speed, you have criteria for, you have a very talented technical staff who knows this kind of stuff. And I wouldn't put yourself in that box. It's like deciding whether the bus that currently leaves Forest Grove at 7:43 should instead leave at 7:38. That's not a board type discussion, and it's no fun to have. Let the professionals do that. Ditto, we were also very, very cognizant on union and personnel matters. That was Mike's bailiwick, and God bless him for dealing with it. Mike Jordan dealt with that, and we did not. We were assiduously stayed out of that sort of thing. Ditto on procurements, contractors. Don't want to have any hint of subjectivity or bias in a contracting process, that you, as long as your role is to oversee that process, that there is a competitive process, that bidding is handled ethically, that there's steps in the way of audits and so on, not to do it yourself. I always used to joke with Mike Jordan that we had very different jobs. I just had to manage 6 other counselors at the meeting, and he had to manage 600 other people in the entire organization, from zookeepers to ushers at the Performing Arts Center to planners. And we would both say, I wouldn't trade you. He said, I wouldn't trade having to manage those 6. And I said, I don't want to manage the other 600. It's great. We have these different things. And his other saying was, with regard to staff and the council, the COO is the gatekeeper, but the gate is always open. If you got a question about anything, I'm going to make sure that you get an answer from the right staff. You want to spend a few hours with the staff talking about an issue, go ahead. But I just need to know about it. I need to manage everybody's time. So I'm the gatekeeper, and the gate is always open. And the information flow is robust from the staff, and you can count on us, and it's honest and it's fair, and it helps us make decisions. But you're not managing the staff. So then the final piece, and then I'm going to turn it over to Fred, but is the external piece. And we were also very clear on this at Metro. And all of us knew, you were chosen on, your positions as directors. We were elected ideally because of our community connections. Fred, you're going to hear from in a minute. He has planning expertise. He's a writer advocate in New Orleans. Christoph's got experience in engineering, like Ozzy does with you guys. Amanda comes from an environmental community. I mean, none of us were born yesterday. We were all appointed to our positions or elected because we have some knowledge. And, you have that too, and that can serve very well. Travis's connection with the chamber, or Kathy at Apano, Linda's links in the education field. Lori's on the library board. I know that because my dad was on the library board for a long time. They live in the same neighborhood. Those are good assets for TriMet. Two-way communication with the constituency, and your visibility in those places is really can be very, very important. And also reflecting back your community connections to management and to the agency. Very, very important. The things that we were always conscious of about who we were speaking for. And we had 7 separate elected officials, all with their opinions, and it just needed to be clear when they were talking as themselves or when they were speaking on behalf of the council or agency. If it was something that the council didn't have a position on, the councilors wouldn't portray their positions as expressing the agency policy. And then once the council votes on an issue, and I was on the losing end once in a while on votes, it said, well, okay, this is the way the agency's going. I had a different opinion that time around, but I wasn't in the majority. And so there's no question the agency's position is what it is. And that's the way it goes. And we'll have another debate another day about some other issue, and life goes on. So our goal here today is just to help you to, think through some of these issues among yourselves, how to be effective, and particularly how you can kind of marshal yourselves to better transit that better serves riders. I think there's no secret that the transit industry right now, like the many sectors of our country, is really in a very critical time and place as our country is. And Portland itself, I think, desperately needs leadership, including on transit. I've been watching and loving Portland transit since the 1970s, and nationally for the last 10 years. Let me tell you, Seattle, San Francisco, Salt Lake City, even Houston, LA, places are not standing still. Portland needs to be moving ahead really fast too. And historically, board members have been a big part of that. Board members are a part of that in other communities. And so we hope that what we tell you about today will inspire you in that way, particularly with regard to growing ridership once all this pandemic is over. So I'll turn it over to Fred at this point. And as I said, Fred is one of my 8 bosses. He's on the board of Transit Center, and he is from New Orleans. And if I can stop sharing, oh, there, I'm going to stop sharing so that he can. And so please, here it is, stop sharing. There we go. Thanks.
Okay. Great. All right. Hey, David, thank you. And let me see if I can share the right piece of information. I'm sure as many people, we have our mini offices set up. I have 2 different monitors and occasionally a third. So is it showing? All right, great. I think it's showing the slideshow, right? Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, David. It was really, well, first off, can everyone see this? I guess let me know, the host, if for some reason the screen doesn't pop up or something happens. But I want to say thank you all for the opportunity to speak. This has been, like I said, during COVID time, I think just it's wonderful to have any chance to talk about transit, to talk with people that are allies, to talk with friends, hear from friends and David and Christoph, and hopefully create some new friends. I also want to acknowledge, so I've been on the Transit Center board for, I guess, almost 2 years now, coming up on, I think, 2 years. And we did our board trip last year. It was a West Coast trip where we started in Portland, then went to Seattle, then Vancouver. And while I've had numerous travels to California, I have family there. This was the first time I'd been to Portland, Oregon, and I thoroughly enjoyed our time in Portland. I arrived a day early, had a chance to ride the transit system a little bit on my own, met one of my college friends I hadn't seen in 20 years, enjoyed the time with the board, and seeing Portland, learning a little bit about it. And I was looking forward to this summer to a trip back to Portland. Another good friend just relocated there recently, and due to COVID, wasn't able to take it. But I am looking forward to my next chance to come and experience your wonderful city. So great, well, I will jump in. I think really, I have a title slide in. I'm in the picture all the way to the right, and I kind of made it a little bit dimmer so the text would stand out. But yes, as David mentioned, I am a board member of New Orleans Regional Transit Authority, which is our, as I similar to TriMet, we are a regional transit agency that's for Orleans Parish, covers parts of Jefferson and St. Bernard. So our region, which I'll share a little bit more about. I am an urban planner. I work for a small consulting firm and have been doing, a lot of land use planning, zoning, code development in my day job. And I've also been a transit rider for a long time in New Orleans. In fact, one of the things that COVID and obviously working from home is that I realized I've probably, in the time I've been living in New Orleans, this is the least amount of transit I've used. Even though I've owned a car for a large portion of that time, but still, this is the least amount of transit I've used, in part because I'm at home, not on the road. So I'm gonna advance the slide. I'm gonna have to do it that way. All right, for some reason, there we go. Okay. So this is really a summary of what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. I have a short presentation, but my New Orleans transit story, really the opportunities and challenges of my transition from advocate to board member, and then share some thoughts on really supporting and engaging transit advocates in your community. David talked a little bit about Transit Center's work in supporting advocacy, which is critical. It's really instrumental. And this slide is one that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just talking about the reasons why advocacy is important in transit and in working with transit agencies, providing an essential push and support of public officials in their efforts to improve transit, which is me and you. I think advocacy, if done well, really provides us the support to make good decisions and to really engage the public. Can help lead to change by looking at problems with a different lens than the agency staff. I think one of our jobs as we have a view and a role as agency board members, the staff is a task, and I think advocates also help us to look at problems and really think about it as our public and ridership does, because we can't be everywhere at all the time. And then really helps agency staff and board navigate let the landmine. And this is really a colloquial for, an issue that we may propose a new plan or some new service or change in the network. And it may meet all the check boxes of good transit or good land use planning or whatever, but it's also often we make decisions in silos based on the information we have, and oftentimes riders and the public have access to different information and can help us really improve our decision making and avoid stepping on landmines or issues that blow up and often distract us from our core mission, and then visionary sees outside of the status quo. So I'm going to just talk really briefly about Ride New Orleans. Ride New Orleans is a community transit advocacy organizing group, nonprofit, think tank, policy developer, and we've kind of stepped into all these different places. We started more than 10 years ago, and essentially Hurricane Katrina, and I could spend hours talking about the effects of Katrina in New Orleans, but one of the things it did, in addition to decimating the entire region, is we lost it damaged almost the entire fleet of our transit vehicles. We lost almost every bus. The streetcars needed significant repair. The ferries needed repair, and it really decimated a transit agency. Additionally, the other thing is, it depopulated the city. And right now we're back up to what I think is unfortunately kind of the standard of around between 85 and maybe 90% of the pre-Katrina population, which means you haven't fully recovered. But in the early years after Katrina, we were much less, 30%, 40%, 50%, which meant you no longer have your ridership. And additionally, some of the hardest hit communities were communities that relied very much on public transit. And in many cases, those families settled in other places where they had access to an essential service. They needed to find employment, to go to school, to make their daily trips. So all of a sudden, we not only have to replace vehicles, we have to also, we're running a gap because there's no revenue as the city's depopulated. And even if we want to provide service, we've lost a lot of our core ridership. Additionally, there were problems in the agency that were long-standing before Katrina due to overspending, lack of management. And in short, by 2018, the federal government was threatening to take over our transit system. The city leadership at the time and the board decided at that point to contract out our entire agency. So I'll pause for a second. And in the world of transit, from what I've learned in my experience, contracting is not uncommon. Some agencies, almost every agency contracts out for special projects, specific parts of service, some maintenance. And numerous agencies contract out their entire operations or pieces of their operations and their maintenance. What we did is not only contract out the operations and the maintenance, but the entire management of our agency. Gave a 10-year contract to a private company. And after that point, there was only one public sector employee. There was still a public board, but at that point, we had turned over everything to the private sector. And I don't mean to get into a diatribe about whether the private sector is good for transit or not, but it essentially led to a lack of transparency, really, especially around investments in new service. And me as a young planner with a bunch of other young planner policy folks, really, we started meeting in bars. Some of that's probably due to just getting over, kind of the after effects of Katrina and that trauma, but also just trying to think about what's wrong with our transit agency, how can we do better, and eventually started a nonprofit. Took a while, we had our lumps, and I can tell more about that story later and some of the things we learned. but eventually it morphed into an organization that really has three key pieces, three key goals in our theory of change. Number one, as advocates, we wanted to drive the conversation around what were the transit needs of our community. Number two, we wanted to build the rider voice, which means engaging day-to-day riders, not just dependent on talking with a bunch of smart college-educated folks who can make some cool GIS maps, but realizing that we needed to be an organization that had space under our umbrella in our organization and leadership for everyone from service workers to service hospitality workers to people, locals who worked in our medical complexes, to students, to young folks. And we really, I think, one of the successes of RIDE is building that room to encompass everyone, and then really winning tangible and regular progress for the agency and for the community. So there's a whole bunch of steps in there that we could talk about, and that normally I would, but I want to jump ahead a bit. So this is a slide, a 4-panel slide that really shows a little bit of the transition. In the top, we're calling rallies, holding signs, engaging political leaders. And the second panel on my right on the top is our current mayor was a city council member showing up at one of our rallies with union leadership and city members and really getting people to talk about transit, again, holding signs, engaging riders in the community. And in short, our current mayor, LaToya Cantrell, former city council person who had worked with RIDE, was elected mayor, took office in 2018 and decided that she wanted to replace some of the transit board members. And due to, at that point, 8 to 9 years of hard work and really community involvement, the thought was we need to put a rider on the board. Oh, who do we go to talk to? Who found out who's a transit rider? Let's talk to RIDE New Orleans. I'm, one of the founders of RIDE and still on the board. And through that process, I got appointed and approved by the city council to join our agency board. So that's a very, very short version of the journey. But it was based in kind of really, creating an organization, creating a voice, being a voice for riders, and then using that to really engage the political decision makers in gaining power. So I want to say that's really the background. Just a few notes, our jobs aren't easy. I think there are a lot of things that we have to think about: long-term agency goals, finances, what does our transit network look like? In our case, regional. A few is a really local, fun with ferries. We had dealing with, a ferry debacle where we spent tens of millions of dollars to buy new ferry boats, used a contractor that had problems building ferries before. And one of our board members at the time had actually had a subcontract with the ferry builder for nuts and bolts, which are one of the things that were failing. And all of a sudden, my first months on the board, we have this controversy as we spent money for boats that we have to send back to the builder, which is finally being resolved. But I think things that maybe we get into this thinking we're going to do a good job. And no, I don't want to spend time reading emails from lawyers and hearing briefings about, rusting of brand new ferries, right? But sometimes things pop up. And then dealing with adversity, COVID-19. In our case, we had a hotel under construction fall at basically the worst possible location for our transit network. It has shut down parts of 2 of our 4 streetcar lines, and it's still not totally resolved. They're still demolishing the building. So I said to say that our jobs aren't easy. And initially, this is New Orleans. I just put this up as an example, but this shows kind of 2005, what our network looked like before Katrina, and in 2016, what it looked like. And just generally, green is good. Green is high frequency lines that run 15 minutes or less. Yellow is 15 to 30 minutes. Red is either 30 to 6 or 8 and 30. And as you can see, we have a network now, as we slowly rebuild back our resources, that runs much less frequent and has much worse on-time performance. So this is going to be helpful to me because we're dealing with a lot of pieces. So I want to say what I learned in my transition that I think might be helpful is, and some of this will parallel what David said, but I really had to develop my voice as a commissioner, really trying, understanding that as an advocate, it was often much clearer where, what I had to speak to and which problem, who I spoke and how I spoke. But as a commissioner, knowing that one of our jobs is to really represent the organization and to guide and lead. And we need to call out, we need to tell the truth. We need to acknowledge when things aren't working well. But there is also a time where or a way that we need to do that as commissioners that really aligns that we have a lot of power and that we need to really use that power and voice to help guide the staff and to welcome input from the public. And it varies for each commissioner, but I had to really think about my voice. I had to really understand the organizational structure. And I think, like David mentioned, it doesn't mean knowing every employee. I'm sure there probably, there are hundreds of employees and their roles, but I needed to really dig in and understand generally about who does what, and especially the senior leaderships, because those are the people that generally present to you at public meetings, and really understanding what their roles are and who they report to. And we could talk about this later, but I think one of the challenges is to not necessarily speak to things and to individuals and ask them to do things that are outside of their role in a public meeting. And it can be really tough sometimes. There's a presentation and we want to start asking questions, and it needs to be combined with a little bit of knowledge about what the staff does. Cultivating a strong relationship with the board administrator for a lot of reasons. And one of the challenges we have is there are 8 commissioners. There are 5 from Orleans Parish, 5 from Jefferson Parish. However, the legislation establishing our agency is based on service hours. So our 5 Orleans Parish votes count for 81.7% of the overall vote of the board. It changes year to year by percentage points. So in essence, 5 votes from ours are 4 votes from Orleans Parish commissioners. And if there's 1 vote from Jefferson, or a 4-4 vote could mean something passes because of this convoluted structure. So really kind of understanding, work with our board administrator to understand we're doing that, and really transitioning, understand what we officially vote on. I think this is really crucial because a lot of times we get a lot of information, and there are things I thought the board did or had power over that didn't. A simple example is contracts. I'm sure you have a system where contracts under a certain amount can be approved administratively by your staff. Certain contracts have to go to RFP. There's a board level. And it doesn't mean we need to understand the dollar amounts, but really being clear, especially when we're speaking about this in public and really understanding how things work. Really, and also, I think participating in opportunities for planning and outreach and engagement, I think that is really crucial. And as an agency, I think if board members aren't invited to participate in those activities when they happen, and knowing we can't be everywhere at all times, that is something I believe we should challenge your staff with, to say, we want you to let us know about these opportunities. This is going to help us do our jobs better. And we need to be aware of these. And it's not that you have to be everywhere. We all have other jobs, I assume, in most cases. But that's one of the ways to really learn and really connect yourself to the agency and the mission. And then David kind of mentioned this. It is really challenging to not try to go into the weeds and solve everything at a public meeting, right? We hear an issue, especially when the public comes up. Oh, let's investigate. Let's dig down. Oh, CEO, can you ask this? Oh, can we get the director of planning? And sometimes that's helpful, but I think it often distracts the staff from what their true duties are. And I think it can also put the staff and the public in a compromising position. Again, we want to tell the truth, but I think we really need to be aware, again, if we understand how the structure works, and then what is our agency in addressing these issues? And also to say, sometimes it's a matter of, from what I've learned, and sometimes my advocate friends get mad at me, say, oh, why didn't y'all speak to that? Well, I think one of the opportunities is to really ask and request and find the information, and then really be transparent with what we do next. So identify problems and really promote transparency. And then I just want to touch on it briefly, and I know I've talked a little bit longer. I think there's a little bit of time for questions if needed, and I'm going to hang on afterwards. But tying back to my advocacy today is that board members should listen to advocates. And what should we look for when talking to your local advocacy group, which I think I've met a few of the people involved and was very impressed. But I think one of the things that, and let me actually pause and say, we were talking and listening to the public. I think one of the things that we really want to have an eye for is there a vision or theme for improving transit in there? Too often, I think when we have public comment period, the expectation is we're just going to hear people complain, or we're going to hear people just talk about their very little niche thing. And those are important and valuable, but really trying to identify what is the theme for improving transit. Are they rider focused? I think this is key. Even for those of us that ride transit, we don't actually, I think we don't necessarily get to speak for all the riders. And as a service organization that provides service to the public, our advocates or people speaking really talking about the improvements or things that help riders? Do they talk about equity? And actually really struggled with this. I think, I've given this presentation another time and I had this in there. I think this should also be, do they talk about equity, but do we as a board and agency talk about equity, right? And do we practice what we preach? So this is almost one that I think can be talked about inwardly. And I will also add, I think the board does have a crucial role in making sure or ensuring that their agency really does the right thing with equity and inclusion and really thinks about their community. I know, sometimes in my case, well, there's a Title VI analysis which is required for route changes, but too often that's a very kind of formula-based approach. And too often we think of formulas and approach as a way to check the box and really think about not checking the box. Do represent the community? And last, are they willing to engage the agency in planning and outreach? One of the things that I think advocacy is really great and can really push is organizations to really do a better job and think about planning and also how do we engage in the community. And that is, it would be great if agencies, and some agencies, and I think we're improving on it internally, at doing a good job at it. We need to do better, but really connecting with advocates who can provide that input. Really, I have two more slides, but one is, one of the things I'd actually recommend on the advocacy side is Transit Center. David mentioned has put out a bunch of great reports. I think this is one of the best one. It's called Winning Transit. That was, I think, 2018 or maybe it was 2019 that David that was produced. But it has really 6 great steps that about, that really is for advocates for the community as a whole. And I think relates to board about vision setting, setting goals, identifying who we need to talk to, are the decision makers, political leaders, telling stories, human stories from a rider perspective, really utilizing, various tactics to keep issues at the forefront, and then supporting opportunities for transit agencies to do good work and celebrating that work. One of the things in my advocate days, we realized right away that even the worst run transit agency probably does some things well, and some things you can build off of, and we can empower the staff. So really, obviously telling the truth, but also being able to acknowledge when good things happen. So last, I'm really engaging and supporting advocates, and this is my last slide, and but I think recognizing advocacy as a critical element in changing the conversation. We should have great values and wonderful ideas, but really advocacy can be the key to really affecting this change in communities. Thinking of advocates as allies. Again, too often, one of the benefits of me being on the board is I think I've been able to influence some of the thoughts of fellow board members who, in the early days saw RIDE as just a pain in the butt, which is actually really good. I'm glad that some of them, because we were, but we were always looking to be allies when in good work and good transit. Cultivate relationships, support agency engagement, and then don't expect advocates to have all the answers. I think too often we expect folks to come in, oh, so this is the problem, what's your solution? And some of that is the staff, but really being a conduit to allow those conversations to happen and to support the staff while creating the space for them to solve the problem. So that's my contact information. And that's really my that's my presentation. Thank you all. I know I've talked for, I don't know if the plan is to, I'll follow for myself if there are any questions now. I think there's going to be opportunities later on, but I hope this is kind of helpful from my perspective, really telling a little bit about my journey, but also what I'm learning and what I think has helped me at a board member, helped our board as a whole. So I can stop my screen share. Let me see if I can do that.
Well, thank you, Fred. I think our plan from this point, then our last formal presentation is going to be Christoph Spieler, former board member from Houston Metro. And he will present, we'll take a little break, and then Amanda is going to join us from San Francisco, and her portion is a little more conversational, and it's not a formal presentation from San Francisco, it's to provoke the conversation among the board. So we'll have Christoph present now. We'll take a short break, and then Amanda's going to lead us through a more participatory discussion then in the balance of our time. Make sense, Bruce? Is that, Mr. Chair?
I think it does. I just want to make sure we do have time to talk about the presentation. So board members, if you really have something you're worried about, that you think you're going to forget in the next half hour or so, let's get it out right now so we can talk about it. Otherwise, I think let's move forward. But let's hear from the board real quickly. There was a lot of good information you guys presented for us.
Excellent. So I'm Christoph Spieler. I served on the board of directors of Houston Metro for 8 years. I'm currently director of planning at Hewitt Zollars, which is a consulting firm in our Houston office. And I'm very happy to be talking to Portland, which is a city that we have often looked to as a model for transit. The idea of a frequent bus network, which we have implemented in Houston, we got from Portland, among other places, and a city I've always enjoyed visiting. I think both Fred and David are actually in this photo that I took last time we were here. And I come to this from a very different place. Houston is a very car-oriented city, and a city that's not really historically known for its transit. But I live a very transit-oriented life in Houston. In this picture, you can see where I live, you can see the office I work in, and you can see the train that can take me back and forth between the two of them. I got into this world as a transit rider. I started taking the bus to get to work and realized that it made my life better. That I had free time, I was able to do writing on the bus, I was more relaxed, I was happier. And my whole reason I am involved in transit and in planning is to give other people that opportunity as well. And like Fred and David both, I started as an advocate. I actually wrote a blog about Houston transportation called Intermodality. And as a result of that, I became the first person appointed to the Houston Metro Board as a direct result of blogging. Metro has a 9-member board, 5 appointed by the city of Houston, 2 by the smaller cities, 2 by Harris County. As you can note here, Houston can outvote the others if it wants to. In reality, it is a much more delicate power balance because the smaller cities in Harris County have quite a bit of power in the legislature. So like every board, there's a lot of sort of back and forth between competing interests. While I was on the board, we got a lot of things accomplished. We built 3 new light rail lines. As I talked about later, we redid our entire local bus network. We put the agency on much more solid financial footing. We started live streaming board meetings and ended up starting the stages of preparing a long-range plan. So it was an amazing experience. But I learned a lot in the process about what it is to be a board member. And I think from the outside world, it often feels like board members are a sort of rubber stamp, that, you know, the board approves what the agency wants to do. And the most obvious public power of a board is the power to vote. That you sit at a table and you have a vote at that table. And that is sometimes a very important power, used both ways. Probably the most important vote I ever cast on the board was the one of an 8-to-1 vote, where I, having politely talked to the board chair about it beforehand, expressed my disagreement with something we were about to put on the ballot. That actually gave me leverage. But I would say that that voting is generally the least important thing that a board member does. That as a board member, you have many more important powers. The first is the power to ask questions. And this is the power to ask questions when you are sitting at a board table, the power to shape that discussion, but also the power to ask questions outside of the boardroom. The thing I did the most as a board member is go to the CEO and ask for briefings from the staff on specific issues I was interested in so I could ask questions about those issues. Not direct, because I would never by myself direct the staff to do anything, but simply ask questions. And that is an incredibly powerful power. You can shine the light onto things that need attention paid to them, you can drive the discussion. And of course, you also have the power to pontificate. That time you spend at the table with a microphone in front of you, that microphone is an incredibly powerful tool if it is used well. I discovered that because I'd actually been a writer, I was good at saying brief, succinct things at a board table, and found myself quite frequently on the news the morning after as the thing the reporters had recorded directly out of the board meeting. Being able to sort of shape a discussion, being able to make statements that help shape how people think about things is an incredibly meaningful thing to do. And as a board, you could see how when we talked about issues, that would slowly shape the way the agency staff talked about the same issues, would slowly shape the way the public and reporters talked about the same issues. And we have the power to convene. Board members are in a great position to be in between agency staff and the public, to, when dealing with agency staff, be representatives of the public, and when dealing with the public, act as go-betweens between the agency and that public. Board members have the ability to convene conversations that need to happen. And that, again, is an incredibly powerful and useful tool. But in doing all of these things, we will continually find as board members that we are trapped between different things. We are pulled in different ways. For example, do we represent the agency or do we represent the writer? When we look at a condition like this, are we thinking about it in terms of the financial sustainability of the agency or our inability to pay for a bench? Or are we looking at it from the standpoint of a writer who has to wait here in August? And I found that often one of the weird, as a board member, you tend to want to defend the organization. But sometimes the fact is that what's on the ground is not defensible. And I found that as a board member, one of the best things I could do is be honest with the public. And when somebody told me about their bus stop, be able to say to them, yes, you're right, that's not good enough, and we can do better. Do you represent the agency or a network? You guys are not in nearly the mess that some places are, but you are a metropolitan area with more than one transit agency. Do you represent one of those agencies, or is your goal to get those agencies working together to create one coherent network? And sometimes a decision may be in the interest of the network, even if it is not narrowly in the interest of the agency. And the tension between a staff and a board. And we can say this at a very high level of what a staff does and a board does, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. Boards are policy making, staff are implementation, but the reality is that interesting role that is a board member where you are not a staff member, you can take advantage of that role to do things that the staff would not. So for example, one of the best things that board members can do is give staff cover. If the staff is doing something good, as a board member, you can defend that. And in fact, you can defend that in a way the staff can't defend themselves. And I found myself in that role often in public meetings where I made sure that if I believed the staff did a good job putting something together and did what they had been asked to do, that I would stand up there and explain that proposal, defend that proposal, and be open, obviously, to input on it, but make sure that the staff wasn't the ones on the firing line. The more you do that, the more likely the staff is to come up with good proposals. We can say things that the staff can't say. When we are talking to the community as board members, we can be more honest and more open, and we don't have to represent the agency. One of my favorite phrases ever was, I'm 1 vote out of 9. I'm speaking for myself, not for the agency. And that is a very useful power. We can push back on elected officials. Every transit agency gets letters like this where one constituent complained to a congressman. That congressman's now like, I want you to put back this one bus stop. The staff is in a very tough position with this. Board members are in a much stronger position to back up the staff and to push back on that elected official and say, actually. And then another big tension. Policy versus implementation. If we say that staff members are in charge of implementation and the board is in charge of policy. How do we balance that? And I would say this is one of the things that we get wrong both ways quite a lot. I will say I definitely got it wrong in leaning too far towards implementation. One of those days where like the alarm bell went on my head and said something's wrong here is when I was reviewing shop drawings for wayfinding signage. I'm like, that is definitely not the role of a board member. And the fact that I was doing that was a sign that we had an organizational problem. In the moment, it may have been the right thing to do, but it was a sign that there was something we needed to fix. And one of the outcomes from that was us hiring an urban designer, so we had someone on the staff who could review those shop drawings. But I've also seen it go wrong the opposite way, that I think a lot of transit consultants and transit agency staff have a tendency to present things which are really policy decisions as if they were technical decisions. For example, if you are choosing the alignment of a light rail line, there is actually no technically correct answer to that question. You will have different alignments that serve different purposes or prioritize different needs. That's a policy decision. And how can we have those discussions? And I think that starts with a board being able to articulate clear goals. And this is one of the tough things about transit. There are a lot of goals transit can have. That we can say our goal is to get people out of cars. We can say that our goal is to provide a safety net for people who do not have other options. We can say our goal is to spend taxpayer money cost effectively. We can say our goal is to create jobs. We can say our goal is to reduce economic impact, environmental impact. We can say that our goal is to promote development. We can say that our goal is to serve as many places as possible. We can say our goal is to carry as many people as possible. And if you just think about the goals, they're all pulling in opposite directions. Like the last two, we literally can't do both this and this at the same time. And that also means we have to discuss trade-offs. Almost every decision we make in transit is a trade-off. We have trade-offs like Jarrett Walker is really good at talking about would you rather have a large number of frequent routes that give you a one-seat ride, or a large number of infrequent routes that give you a one-seat ride, or a smaller number of frequent routes that require transfers? Or would you rather walk more to get to a faster, straighter route, or walk less to get to a more circuitous route? And those trade-offs aren't always fun to discuss. Like there is a trade-off between paratransit service and fixed route bus service. We know it's cheaper to carry somebody in a fixed route bus, and we have a finite agency budget, and we can't ignore that fact when we make budgeting decisions. And sometimes those trade-offs are really large scale. One of the things I see a lot is that in transit, in regional governance, we tend to value things that look big on a regional map. Here's the San Francisco Bay Area. If you look at all three rail projects on the left, represented by the red lines on the left side, they carry fewer people combined than that little red line on the right. But politically, you know you're going to get a lot more support for the stuff on the left. That the length of transit is not a good measure of how useful it actually is. How do we have those conversations? How do we understand what benefit we are actually getting out of projects? And I have seen a lot of agencies dodge these kind of questions, adopt mission statements like this one, where it says that the transportation strategy will provide competitive and convenient services at a financially feasible cost per rider that will allocate available funds in an equitable manner to address the needs of everyone and respect the character of neighborhoods and the structure of each community. This is an utterly meaningless statement. This statement gives no help whatsoever to the staff in making decisions. And a good statement of goals is something you can actually measure. And one of the things I think we need to do a lot more of in transit is think about what we measure. Because often we measure the wrong things. Often we measure the things that are easy to measure. How can we measure those things in ways that actually reflect the passenger experience? This is some work I've been doing with MBTA in Boston about what kind of metrics could we put on the passenger experience, where the top line is this is what passengers want, and the lines below that is how could we actually measure those things? We as board members can help develop processes. Like one of the things I was proud of at Metro is we developed the process for naming stations, which got us out of a lot of political trouble when it came to actually naming stations, as we'd adopted the guidelines we were working within already. We weren't having to make case-by-case decisions. We had broad guidelines to operate under. And so thinking about what role can the board play there, and a really good example is when we redid our bus network, we actually discussed the request for qualifications for our consultants at the board level. We wrote a document that clearly said what we were trying to accomplish, and that laid out a set of clear metrics, evaluation standards for evaluating that, and we set up a selection committee that actually included community members on it. By doing this, it meant that as a board, we could actually sit back when it came to the actual consultant selection. We didn't argue at the board table about which consultant we had hired, since we had put the right guidelines in place in the first place so that the staff could make the right decision there. As board members, we can ask for options, say, what are the scenarios for this? And as board members, we can ask the right questions. We can think about building rather than operations. We can think about operations rather than building, as we have a tendency as agencies to like really focus on stuff that has ribbon cuttings. But the most important thing to passengers is what's the service on the ground. We can focus less on questions like, is it a train or a bus? This is one of my favorite photos. It's a bus in Toronto having an identity crisis. But we can steer the conversations to the things that really matter. And I would argue that as board members, we ought to be thinking as riders. That the rider is not standing on that platform asking, does this have steel wheels on a steel rail with electric catenary power and that great right of way? They are asking, when is it coming? Does it go where I need to go? How long will that trip take? As board members, we can ask what's going to go wrong. We can pay attention to the actual data and trust that data. We know an awful lot about who's riding that isn't necessarily represented by who shows up to a public meeting. We should trust that data and make decisions based on it. And we can make sure we focus on the right things. Are we focusing on cars or are we focusing on pedestrians? And we have to be cautious of anecdotes. One of the things I found over and over again is that we would tend to focus a lot of effort on really small things. One board speaker would come up and we'd have a session about redesigning an entire bus route over a single stop that could have been fixed by putting an apartment complex gate in the correct location so that riders didn't have to walk all the way around. And a lot of the media framing of transit is really problematic here. You see reporters write articles like this one that says, you're redesigning the bus network and it's worse for low-income communities, except when you actually ran the numbers, it was a vast improvement. That when we actually looked at where is our frequent service compared to population density of low-income residents, that we were greatly improving that. So that kind of anecdotal framing, telling a story about one rider at a time, is not the way to plan a good transit network. But the trick we have in what we do is that to create good transit, we must convince stakeholders and decision makers who do not themselves ride transit. And this is true in Houston, this is true in Portland. It's even true in New York City, where you had a board member get in trouble for parking his private car in a bus lane in order to attend board meetings. And people who do not ride transit really don't understand transit. For example, if you drive, there is no such concept as frequency. But if you ride transit, frequency is everything. And I would argue that transit agencies, for the most part, are really bad at actually explaining transit. And that leads to real outcomes. This is King County Metro with a proposal that actually would have made transit service better. But in the process of making service better, it would actually eliminate one route variation. And then here you can see the response to that framed as, you are cutting a bus route. We as agencies have to actually explain what we're trying to do. And what I would say is my biggest lesson from being a board member is we have to get better at telling stories. Here is me at a neighborhood association meeting. I did a lot of this. I give a lot of presentations as a board member, and I think it's actually one of the most useful things I did, and it is the way that I had the biggest impact. At Metro, we were seeing bus ridership dropping. Light rail was doing great, the park and rides were doing great, the local buses were losing ridership. But if you look at these numbers, that was actually as we were adding service. So we were providing more service and people weren't riding. So I started asking, why aren't people riding the bus? And here were my answers. The bus is infrequent. We had a lot of hourly and half-hourly buses, cases where people had to plan their life around the transit rather than transit being there when they needed it. The bus was confusing. We had things like Route 40 with 2 branches on the north end, an occasional express service on the south end feeding into 3 loops that ran in opposite directions on the same street. We had a bus network where to go between 2 spots, you sometimes had to make 2 transfers, even though those 2 locations were on the same street. We had a network where this is what service looked like on a weekday, this is what service looked like on a Saturday, this is what service looked like on a Sunday. And we had a network that didn't match where people lived. The Houston region had grown and the network had not adjusted to serve those places. We had a network that didn't match where people worked because new employment centers had developed and people in those employment centers weren't using transit because the transit wasn't good enough. So why is a bus network so bad? I gave the example of the number 11 Nance bus. This started out in the 1920s as the Nance streetcar. And the yellow line here is Nance Street, and the black line is the Nance streetcar, and you can see absolutely why that was called the Nance streetcar. Here was what that turned into. It got extended outwards, it got rerouted to hit some other destinations, and then when the highway department cut Nance Street in half, it was rerouted off of Nance Street. But that destination board at the front still said Nance, because this is what happens when you take a route and make little changes one bit at a time, where every change makes sense on its own, but the total sum of those changes doesn't. So we asked, what would our bus network look like if we reimagined it from a clean sheet of paper? And we were able to take a map that looked like this in terms of frequency, red routes are 15 minutes or better, and turn it into that. We were able to take a network that was focused on downtown and turn it into a crosstown grid, so people who weren't going downtown wouldn't be forced through downtown to get there. And we were able to take a network that looked like this on a Sunday morning and run every bus route that Houston has as frequently on a Sunday morning as it runs midday on a Monday. That's more than 20 bus routes which run all day Sunday at 15 minutes or better. The result of that is that 3/4 of ridership is now on frequent routes, that 93% of riders could access the same system at the same stop as they did today, but we went from 25 to 75% of riders on those frequent routes, and Houston gaining ridership at a time when most transit agencies across the country were losing it, including a 33% gain in ridership on a Sunday. This new network, which we implemented overnight in 2015, transformed what it's like to use transit in Houston, put many more people within walking distance of frequent transit. And I would say our transit map, actually, in a lot of ways, this is from my book, Trains, Buses, People, an Opinionated Atlas of U.S. Transit, showing the coverage of frequent transit service, looks a lot more like places like Portland now. But I will say that even as I showed this Portland map, you can see gaps in here. You can see places that have the density and don't have the service. So I would say that as a board member, you have some real power, that power to vote, the power to ask, the power to pontificate, the power to convene. And that bully pulpit, that ability to tell stories and shape the conversation is the most powerful thing that you have. And with that, I'm looking forward to our questions later.
Excellent. Well, David, I think we've had our first 3 presenters, 2 presenters and you. So I see the schedule maybe take about a 10-minute break and then come back and ask some questions. Is that the
Sure,
That
yeah.
way,
I think that Amanda Eakin from San Francisco will join us, and she'd like to kind of moderate some of that conversation. Yeah, and
All right.
that's the end of the formal presentations there. So why don't we go to the break and then come back with Amanda?
All right, so we'll come back at 1:40. How about that, guys? And we'll hear from Amanda first, and then go into the discussion. Is that the idea? All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's approaching this as a discussion.
All right. All right. Good presentations, you guys. That was very provocative, and I think there'll be a lot of good conversation starters as a result of that. So let's come back on in about 10 minutes.
Sure, just briefly, Amanda Eakin is with the Natural Resources Defense Council. It was appointed by Mayor Breed to the Muni Board, and she'll have a few just introductory comments, but her interest is now in sort of moderating a conversation among the group. No formal presentation, but I'll turn it over to Amanda. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So just again, my name is Amanda Eakin. I'm the Director of Transportation for a project that's called the Bloomberg American Cities Challenge at NRDC. It's a 25-city project around the country, and Portland is one of the cities in the 2-year Climate Accelerator project. And we've worked with Portland on rose lanes and flow streets and all kinds of fascinating initiatives. My background, I'll just say, is in city planning, and I grew up in New York City, taking the M79 crosstown bus every day to school. So I thought that it would be great, just because we're all getting to know one another, if we could just do some introductions, and if you could just say your name for those on the board. You could say your name and just one thing you love about serving on the board of a transit agency. I thought that would be really great. And I can start just to give you a moment to think. And so what I love about being on the SFMTA board is that I honestly feel connected to San Francisco in a new way. Whenever I see a bus go by, I'll feel proud of that operator. Whenever I see a bunch of teenagers on the back of the bus littering trash on the floor, I tell them to pick it up. That's my bus. That's part of our system. You have to respect it. And I just feel really connected to the city in a different kind of way. So maybe, Bruce, can I turn it over to you? And then after people share, just call on one of your colleagues on the board and we can kind of popcorn around.
Yeah, sure. Put me on the spot first. Okay. So I have to tell stories about, I actually moved to Portland in 1974 and January of 1974. And probably people don't remember what was going on in this January of 1974, but I do. That was the odd even gas rationing and essentially the oil embargoes. And so I learned to rely on transit and the bus to get me to work. So my first job out of graduate school was down here in Portland. So I agree with you. I think the biggest thing that I saw with transit was it was a good opportunity to see other parts of the city and not drive, and also meet people. And back then, people weren't really focusing on their iPads and iPhones as much, and I got to know a number of people riding the buses and learned a little bit about them and their interests. And back then also, I lived at the end of the line, so I got to know the bus drivers and got to know them personally. And they would wake me up occasionally in the evenings so when I was coming home. I forget to fall asleep on the bus. But yeah, I agree. I always thought the transit was a vital part of the community, and it was underappreciated, I thought. And so I'm pleased to say in my professional career, I've been involved in transportation, most of it, and been a big supporter of transit for the reasons you just described. It's a tool. It's a very important tool for the economy and for growth. And I think we still haven't realized its full potential, and I'm hoping we can. So you want me to turn it over to our vice chair, Travis, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Well, you bet.
So, I mean, I can't really add too much of what Bruce, what you just said. in regards to kind of the overall benefit of transit and what we have the ability and opportunity to offer, except for, what I see as, I just think there's so much contribution that transit makes and can make, and it's absolutely been, for me, over the last 9 years that I've had the opportunity to be a part of the board, just the contribution that we've been able to make in ensuring that we've raised the visibility of transit, some of the opportunities that it has to deliver on many of the things that you just referenced, Bruce. And so, I can't say enough about how I appreciated transit and its impact, its positive impact prior, and now I even appreciate it more. And as many of you know, I lived in a transit-oriented development for 13 years and got the benefit of just hopping on the MAX and going all over the city, and further appreciating the opportunity that we have. David talked about in the beginning the concept of the impact of single occupancy cars and vehicles and its contribution to the issues with carbon. And I would have to say, being from Kansas, originally we don't look at transit as we look at it, somewhat on the West Coast and somewhat in the larger major metropolitan cities. And so coming to Portland, originally I didn't really have the appreciation for transit that I do now, and its accessibility. And I know I told the one story before, but years ago when I first joined the board, it was a Saturday morning. I got up and I had like about 6 errands that I had to run. And I said, okay, I'm going to do it all on transit. So I blocked out the entire day because it was going to take an entire day to use transit to do all this. By 1 p.m., I was home and I'd gotten everything done. And what I didn't appreciate that I did afterwards was the proximity of how close we are, which the one that surprised me the most is when I'm on the top of Mount Tabor. And I'm thinking I'm gonna have to walk a long way before I get to transit. And it said that it was like 400 feet or yards away, and I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe we had that type of coverage. So it's been for me almost 9 years on the TriMet board. I've really appreciated more so the responsibilities that we have in ensuring that we are have an incredibly positive impact on transit, on climate change. Everything that's been presented so far in this conversation has been something that I embrace and will continue to embrace eventually as I roll off the board and potentially go to other opportunities in leadership. As we all know, running for mayor of Gresham also gives me this incredible appreciation of how we can leverage transit to better deliver for our citizens in East County.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just as we move through the other board members, if you could just do your name and sort of one thing you love about serving on the transit board, just for sake of time, that would be great. I don't know if I'll pass it to somebody else. Bruce?
How about Linda?
Linda, great.
Okay. I'm not the newest board member, but compared to Travis and Bruce, I'm one of the newer board members. And I came to the transit board at the request of a local mayor to serve a part of the Portland metro area that at that point was vacant within the TriMet board. And being somebody who's worked in higher education, where access was a big part of my career background, I felt that there was a real relevancy to access in terms of what transit would provide. I bring to the board, and what I've enjoyed serving on the board is I tend to look at things from a very factual, empirical way, and also look at the business practices that we have actually strengthened over the last 2 to 3 years within the organization. And so I've lived and been in places where I've relied totally on transit, but I currently live in a part of the region where it's almost not available to me. So I'm an advocate for providing more transit to the southern part of the greater Portland metro area. And so that's what I bring to the board, is a strong financial acumen, business practices, organizational transformation background, and I've enjoyed the interplay with the board and the general manager in terms of watching the evolution of what is going on within the agency. I'm obviously troubled by some of the issues in Portland right now, and the fact that, no one ever, you can't make everyone happy all the time. And so you get a lot of dissent because that's what you hear as a board member.
Thank you.
How about you, Keith?
Well, thank you. I'm one of the newest board members. I've only been here 28 months, even though I'm probably one of the oldest board members. And I appreciate the fact that I'm on a board with so much diversity, and so we all bring different perspectives, and we're able to listen with open-mindedness and come to decisions and be able to. There's a oneness in the group, I think, that comes from being able to listen to someone and value their experience and value their what they're sharing with the board. Even though we may not have experienced it, we're able to understand that this is real. And I appreciate the fact too that we've got a great general manager that is very open-minded as well. And without being too shameful, I will also applaud our board chair because I think he does an excellent job as well. And not lording over us, but always listening to what we have to say and then bringing his wisdom into it. So I appreciate all of that.
Kathy, you're the next closest here to Keith on my screen.
I thought you were going to save the best for last, Bruce.
Oh.
I'm just kidding. Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Kathy, and I was appointed in 2018 along with Keith and Ozzy, and I've been taking transit since I was 14 years old, living here in the city of Portland primarily, and now representing Clackamas County, which is an entire region as a board member to consider when we're thinking about so many different decisions that impact our communities. And I think one of the reasons, I forgot what the prompt was, but I think it was around just the importance of transit. And I also identify as a millennial, and I feel like all the issues that we're seeing right now around climate change in particular, just racial injustices, I feel like my generation is definitely helping shape those conversations, and I think in a progressive way. And I am proud to be part of that generation that is making some change around institutions and systems that have, historically excluded folks of color or low-income people. So I'm really proud of the work that TriMet has done before in the past, and I think we can move along this journey of equity that we have also adopted as an agency. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good. Ozzy, you pushing your mute button?
Yes, I am. And last but not least.
No, you're not last. Still got Lori.
Oh, man.
I'm last.
What? Saving the best, definitely. Then Ozzy, and I again joined at the same time with Keith and Kathy. I'm an urban ecologist by training. I've been involved in climate science. Climate action has been so important to me. And one thing I love about serving on the board is that I feel like this is such an impactful moment in time to be involved in the transit conversation. At a time when the transit represents a huge impact, the kind of global overall impact. We are changing how we move, why we move, what we move, where we move, and what fuels and vehicles we use to move those things. And it's a really exciting time to be in this agency with that conversation at the centerpiece. And I really look forward to seeing that impact translate into some meaningful, really meaningful systemic change around how we move ourselves in a direction intentionally so that we address the environmental impact and the social impact. So it's really exciting to see the agency already expanding the work of the board into areas that have not always been our bailiwick, but are still meaningful places like purchasing, hiring, apprenticeship. We find more of those conversations bubbling up because they impact broader systems. And so, yeah, what to do with that in this time is the exciting thing. So I'm really liking this conversation.
And now, last but not least, Director Bauman.
Hi, everybody.
Boy.
I'm Lori Bauman. I live in the transit-rich neighborhood where David Bracton grew up. Many folks know that because of family connections, I have a special interest in service to people with disabilities. So that's a real passion of mine. But what I've enjoyed about being on the board is getting to know intimately an organization that such a interesting and complex organization. Urban planning, technology, logistics, customer service, even law enforcement, all is within this agency. So that has just been a real pleasure for me and a real exciting piece of being on the board.
Cool.
Wonderful. Did we get everybody, Bruce?
I think we've got all the board members. Doug, you've been listening on us. Did you have anything you want to kind of add from watching it from your point of view?
No. I think for me, I think the diversity and of experience and culture is a strength of this board. I do believe there is a real thirst to not only learn as individuals, but as a board overall in a changing landscape of how we shape this region. Which mobility, transit, and beyond transit, mobility is a very strategic weapon and tool. And then how you manage and embed the needed cultural changes of equity in that. So I think there's an unsettlement in all of this, and in there is actually opportunity to me. And so I think the combination allows us to have different conversations and be better listeners, frankly, than we've ever probably had to be before. And I think the timing is to, not only this session, but where Portland is in the industry and within the context of where do we want to go as a thought leader in a lot of these conversations and a role model to help evoke other parts of our society with us. So I think this is a beautiful time and instrument to take advantage of the chaos for some, but it's a chance to settle new norms that probably are long overdue. So I see opportunity written all over this. So.
Okay, good. Well, Amanda, David, what did you hear in those conversations that we ought to explore further?
So I'm just going to make a few remarks, Bruce, because David had asked me to speak about my experience as a board member and public engagement, and also some of my experiences being an advocate and how to talk about my personal knowledge and opinions in the context of a collective board. So I'm just going to share 3 observations for your consideration, and then I have some discussion questions, and I also heard some really excellent, further provocative discussion questions we should get into. Okay. The first observation I wanted to offer is what I will call the relentless pursuit of common ground. There's a story in NRDC lore about Robert Redford, who sat on our board and has been a friend of NRDC for many years. And there's a story about how he was helping to negotiate between some developers who want to drill for oil and some environmentalists. And the first thing he did was he got out a map and he had the environmentalists circle all the places that were the highest conservation value areas that were the most precious to them. And then he had the oil drillers circle on the map the places where they were looking for, drilling. And any place that was not a prime conservation area, that was an oil, was a place that oil companies wanted to drill, he said, like, we can start here. This is where we can start. We're not going to agree on everything, but it looks like these pieces, these areas are common ground. And I raise that story because I think we have all kinds of, as you do in Portland, diversity in our public members who want to contribute to our conversations, and we're not going to all agree on everything. But I feel like if you just keep putting in the effort, keep trying to find what is that place of common ground where we can start and agree on something and build trust, that can often be a really helpful way to go from there. So that's sort of one finding on public engagement. The second is, as an environmentalist, you don't need to look very far to see our agency's, SFMTA's climate commitment. A very big part of San Francisco's overall plan to hit our climate goals is that by 2030, which is in 10 years, 80% of all trips in San Francisco have to be by walking, biking, or transit. Well, right now we're at 47%. So sometimes I know I may sometimes sound like a broken record, but I try to keep reminding staff in our meetings that we have this very ambitious and very specific target, 80% walking, biking, transit. So whether we're talking about street space, whether we're talking about our budgets, I always try to keep coming back to that goal, because I don't have to convince the agency or the city that that's our goal. We've got that goal. And we as an agency play an incredibly important role, I think, as does yours, in San Francisco's and Portland's overall climate ambitions. The third point I just wanted to make, and a finding and observation from my perspective, when it comes to engaging the public, I think we have been the most successful as an agency when the staff bring their best and clearest thinking to the board about a few thoughtfully considered options. And they're sharing analysis, pros and cons of the options, and then we're asking very specific feedback from the public. I want to just draw an example that thinking back to the budget conversations we had earlier this year. I thought this was just really, really excellent public discourse. We needed to raise revenues. Of course, one of the options on the table that's never popular is to raise transit fares. And many people were saying, we can't stomach those transit fares. Don't balance the budget on the back of transit riders. So staff did a lot of very, very thoughtful analysis, looking at all the different fare media that people use to pay for transit: single ride cash fare, monthly transit passes, clipper cards, et cetera. And what happened that I thought was really great was that the board learned right alongside the public. We all learned together that the fare medium that is most frequently used by our most low income riders was a single use cash fare, paying, $2.75, paying $3 in cash. And we learned that a very significant portion of people paying that are low income. Now, staff had originally proposed bumping up that single ride cash fare from $3 to $3.25. By contrast, when you bring like an equity analysis is what we brought. By contrast, it turns out the people with the monthly clipper card, where we were giving them a 25% discount or 25% discount to incentivize them to use a clipper card. But it turns out those people have much higher incomes than the people paying their $2.75 by cash each time. And with that knowledge, I just felt like the board could make this very informed decision. It was like, okay, let's not raise fares on the people that have the lowest incomes. Let's raise our revenue for the people who have the most ability to tolerate it, 10, 20 cent increase in their fares. And we ended up deciding to hold that single-use cash fare at $3 and instead reduce the discount for the people who have higher incomes with a monthly fare. And I just thought that was like government operating at its best, because it wasn't, sometimes you hear from advocates, they want something, and staff just says, no, we can't do that. Or sort of like, I don't hear you, I don't validate you. And I think when the staff works to bring the board and the public right along with them in their analytical process, laying out the challenges, analyzing the alternatives, and helping members of the public really stand in their shoes, I think that's when we really do our best. And it's a little bit funny, but it makes me think of a song from a Bay Area artist. And he has a line in his song where he says, you know, if it's so easy, you try. Here, you try, you know? And I feel like that's sometimes a helpful framework to think about. It's easy to be an advocate on the outside saying, do this, do that. I think when staff can really engage with the public and invite them into the problem solving with us, with all the constraints we face, we just elevate the quality of the public discourse here in San Francisco. So just wanted to share those couple reactions. And I'll stop there and see if you have any questions or reactions, and then I have some discussion questions.
Good, Bruce.
You're muted, Bruce.
How about we try that? What I was saying, I was calling on Lori since she was last on the first one. But it looks like you're ready to go, Ozzy.
No, I just was waiting for you to.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Lori, how about you? Have some thoughts?
Thoughts about what we've heard so far today? Well, I first want to say just everything we heard has just been excellent. I want to thank everybody for what you've presented to us. It really a lot of food for thought. You know, I said this before. I thought a lot about what is our board. I come from having spent a career as a business lawyer, so I think of a corporate board, you know, the board of directors of a private corporation. Is that what we are? In a way, in a sense, we are, because we've been appointed, it appears, based on our skills. Diversity. I'm the lawyer, you know, Travis is the finance guy, and you know, Keith is the union guy, for example. But then again, we're also like a legislature, right? We enact ordinances. We represent geographic districts, and so that makes us different from a corporate board. So I am constantly going through this thought process. You know, what are we? You know, kind of fish or fowl, and so that's an issue that I'm very interested in, and I think some of the presentations today address that.
I mean, I might throw out there that one of the interesting differences between a transit board and a corporate board is a typical corporation has a very clear goal. Its goal is to make money for the shareholders. And essentially, the board's job is to hire somebody who's capable of making money for the shareholders and to have a fiduciary responsibility of watching over that CEO. I think one of the things that's so different about a transit board is the agency's goal will never be that clear, that succinct, or that easy to measure. And that makes a transit board's job a lot harder because it has to sort of play a much bigger role in discussion of goals than a corporate board ever really has to.
Thanks.
That's an excellent point.
Anybody else work right there?
Read that.
You looking down? Yeah, is that you?
Yes,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Amanda, that's very aggressive, 47 to 80% in 10 years. I know there's got to be a lot of moving parts. And so I would like to know how you're approaching bringing everyone together to be on the same page to achieve that. Because I know that there's got to be folks who are saying, well, this is, and we have our environmental justice issues that we're concerned about. And then other folks are saying, well, we have our engineering and design issues that we're concerned about, and the city planning issues that we're concerned about. And so how do you get all of those to come together to understand that, you know, we've made this goal, now we're going to work to achieve it, and be intentional about it? You're muted, Amanda. Amanda, you're muted.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I had to switch over my audio, but I think you were talking about, Keith, how do you bring together different stakeholders? And when people have such different views, how do you reach a common ground? Does that sort of capture it?
And I think he was also just saying,
Yes.
how are you going to be able to do what you're talking about in terms of that major shift?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll just throw out one example I've seen work really, really well as maybe a model. And this is San Francisco's County Transportation Authority is convening a series of stakeholders on the topic of congestion pricing in downtown, which is a topic that people have many, many opinions about. And those are not the same opinions, especially as the agency who would like to see this done. And what they've done is they've created this policy advisory committee, and they've really just set the table so thoughtfully, bringing equity groups, community-based organizations, public health groups, labor, the business, the Chamber of Commerce is at the table. Every last person you could think of who would have an opinion about congestion pricing is at this table. And they've brought this group together, and it's truly a labor of love because it's, the meetings are hard and they go long and they don't finish what they were trying to do. It is absolutely an inclusive planning process, and they provide childcare and they provide food at the meetings, and then they sort of do everything the best that they can think of. And I just think this has been a really exemplary process in terms of getting all those interests around the table. Literally, they're seated in a U shape so everybody can see everybody. And they have these very specific goals they work through at every meeting, and it really is like that's the forum to really hash out the issues. So it's not as though it's the SFMTA board or SFCTA board, and they're asking everybody to come and, stand at the microphone for 2 minutes and just give your public comment, and then you have to leave. This is the meeting, and the public can address this body of stakeholders, and these stakeholders get to vote on what should be the goals of congestion pricing and how we ought to go ahead and do it. And I think Portland, quite honestly, your pricing options for equitable mobility, your POEM task force process, is similarly that very thoughtful, equitable engagement approach where you're getting the stakeholders together, putting in the time, and really, really deeply listening, as one of you said, to people about what they want to see, what their goals are. And I think we can learn a lot from these kinds of processes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Looking for others. Maybe you want to speak?
I have my hand up.
Okay. Well, there you go, Kathy, please.
Okay, sorry, let me put my hand down now. Thank you so much for our guest speakers. I've heard a little bit about just the great work that you do on the boards or former boards that you represent in your areas. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit deeper about equity because we know that there are just so many different places now that have adopted equity frameworks and vision statements and this sort of, I think, really thoughtfully put together statements around also addressing, systemic racism. And we can't talk about equity without really talking about those structures and institutions that have benefited privileged class of folks. So I guess my question is, on your boards, how are you continuing to improve your racial equity lens in either trying to talk about race and power in ways that also shows up in decision making or among your board members or around stakeholders? And then the second question is, how do we get to continue to operationalize it? Because I think it's one thing to have a beautiful document and say, hey, we have this on our website, or, but how do we really get to operationalize it so that, again, the people that are most impacted by climate change, by fare increases, by policing, whatever issues, we make their lives better. So that's a big question, but I'm really curious as to how are you having those hard, difficult conversations again around race, power, privilege, class, even amongst your own board?
This is Fred. I'll maybe jump in and talk a little bit about one of the things I left a little bit unsaid about our New Orleans story with my presentation just off of time, but we are in the process, still back in the process of changing back from a totally contracted out agency to a fully public sector agency. So we've had some, maybe a little bit of an opportunity more than some cities or communities and agencies do to really talk about equity and inclusion as we rebuild our agency and making that at the top. It is a tough conversation. I think it helps having board members that are willing to embrace the discussion. We had a board retreat. In fact, we had a board retreat this past weekend, mainly virtual. A few of us were socially distanced in our agency headquarters, but we decided that we needed to have this conversation and dedicate half of the retreat and the public portion of it to really talking about equity. I think it's a conversation that it really benefits from having it in a public forum. And again, understanding, there's a lot we have to do in your meetings. You have limited amount of time, you have limited meetings, but it really helped to, number one, to really clearly articulate that this is going to be a priority. And then, I think support the staff really. Again, we know as a board, we don't get to hire and fire or make individual employment decisions, but we've been really clear as we look at our organizational structure that we want to see whether it's through a particular role or positions are equivalent hours of work, positions that that work toward the goal, work toward our equity goals. So some agencies, it may even be, a senior leadership person that with the title around equity. But I think that was one of the roles that we can articulate. We're not going to say, oh, you need to hire this person, but, oh, can you reflect this in our organizational structure? And then the last piece, one of the toughest parts of this conversation, if we're being honest, is really with our friends and our other allies and our other community stakeholders who frankly maybe get offended if we say something like, well, our network reflects a legacy of racist decision-making in our community. And I don't think New Orleans is unique at being a southern city, and I think it doesn't matter where you're at in this country, that's true. And we're in the middle of a network redesign process. So I think as a board member, we don't say it as a way to reflect negatively on our agency or even on the staff, because I think we have to recognize that that not one individual staff member, even if they've been with your agency for a long time, is responsible for that. It's just how our systems work. So really, I think, saying in a way that doesn't blame the staff or individuals, but say this is an opportunity in our short time as board members we have it to really think about this and really provide input to the staff and invite the community to the discussion. So a lot of it I'll set up, but is not being afraid to say that out loud and not being afraid to really help guide the staff and say, we want to make this a priority. This is in our plan. We think this is worthwhile. Help us develop a plan moving forward to do this.
Yeah, I would add to that as a board member, we are frequently in a position where we are weighing in on decisions that are being made in a place and in a context where race plays a lot of roles. And where income and class play a lot of roles. And we always should be asking the questions about who's not in this discussion, whose needs are not being considered, who are we not hearing from, who are people speaking for. I think one of the best examples that came up multiple times is we'd have a request from a neighborhood association to say, move this bus route out of our neighborhood. Or it's a quiet neighborhood street, why are you running buses down it? It's unsafe, whatever. And you would quickly realize when you started asking those questions that that neighborhood association represents homeowners who are probably whiter and wealthier than the neighborhood as a whole, and whiter and wealthier than the riders of the bus. And the people riding that bus are not attending the homeowners association. In fact, a lot of them don't live in that neighborhood. That neighborhood is on the way to where they are going. And it's really easy as a transit agency when the only people you're hearing from are the people who say move that bus route, to just move the bus route. And guess what? You probably aren't going to get into any trouble because the people whose lives you're making worse are people who don't have that access, who don't have that ability to communicate. And so what can you do as an agency to make a better decision there? Can you actually reach out to the people who might be affected by it? Or do you need to step back and say, let's look at the data, and we know people are riding this bus, and we know people are boarding this bus, and we know we will make their lives worse even if we don't hear from them. So I think always asking, who are we not hearing from? And the second thing is, to echo Fred's point, the systems we're operating today are full of inherited racism. I mean, you look at highways and you realize that when our interstate highways were built, Black people couldn't vote in many of the cities that they were built to. So their point of view was not represented in those systems. And if we are reconstructing those highways today, we are solidifying that embedded racism. And that's true for transit as well. And one of the things I find the more I look at transit is there's a lot of things we think of as technical that in fact have real race issues embedded in them. Like, I would argue that if you look at US transit systems that have different crowding standards for local buses than for commuter rail, like literally there are systems that say on commuter rail, everybody gets a seat. On local buses, it's okay if half the people stand. It's actually easier to stand on a commuter rail train than it is to stand on a bus. The ride's much smoother. The reason we're doing that is because the commuter rail was intentionally designed to be a premium service for wealthy commuters, and we're giving them better quality service. So we should be questioning standards like that. We should be questioning, why is it that we assume every light rail stop is going to get a canopy and seating? Why don't we make that same assumption for every bus stop? And I would say if you dig into the history of that in most US cities, that's because those bus riders were seen as low income and minority and dependent riders who we didn't need to do nice things for. So I think those of us who are in any position of power in the transit agency ought to keep questioning our standards and our assumptions and the way we do things, because the realization is just because we do it that way right now doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. And often the reason we do it that way right now is because of past racist decisions.
Thanks for that comment. Good one. Kathy, did that answer your question? Yeah.
There's a lot to offer from San Francisco, but I guess I'd love to get to other questions, if there are other questions.
I'm looking, anybody have your hand raised? See, Keith, you got your hand raised again, or is that just from the last time you wanted to talk?
Oh, I have my hand raised again because okay. Chris brought something to mind an issue that I'm really concerned about, and that is homeless or houseless people having a voice, because they do use transit. They don't use it at the level, of course, of the other populations, but at the same time they do use it, and too often they are dismissed or discounted and don't have a voice. And I'd like to know from Chris or Amanda or Fred how you have dealt with that to try to make sure that their issues and concerns are being addressed and they do have a voice and a seat at the table.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts I can offer on that one. One of the ways, because not everybody can get to a board meeting, right? Even though they're right on the phone now, or you can dial in. Not everybody, that's not accessible to everybody. So in some cases, we've been doing outreach on the muni vehicles themselves, which is a way we can take our process to transit riders. And another one I'll note is our ambassadors program. These are, I think this is an award-winning program where we engage members of the community to kind of ride along on the transit vehicles, and also to be sort of safety ambassadors at the transit stops, kind of to be a face of the agency, to answer people's questions, to hear their concerns, to be kind of an alternative, a friendlier alternative to sort of police enforcement on muni vehicles. And I think that's another opportunity for us to connect with types of people who wouldn't necessarily show up at a public meeting.
And I will say, I mean, in what board members can do, homelessness is clearly a problem that goes far beyond the power of transit agencies to solve. And sometimes transit is where it shows up. Transit is where you have riders coming and saying, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing here, but it's not within the power of the transit agency to solve the underlying problem, which is that you have people who need homes, that you have people who need better health care, and you have people who need food. And I think it is something that a board member can do to essentially say that. Go back to the city and the county and everybody else and say, this is a problem you have responsibility for, and we need to figure out how to work together to resolve the underlying problem rather than try to solve the symptoms using things like policing or cutting overnight service or all the other things transit agencies have done in response to having homeless on the buses. And I would underline, Amanda, they're riders too. They're also trying to get somewhere, and we should be treating them as riders and not as nuisances.
Yeah. I think to what Christoph said, this is one of the reasons why I think having a diverse board, diverse community connected board is a great thing, right? I think this is an area where board members have the opportunity to utilize their community connections, because like Christoph said, it's an issue bigger than just a transit agency, but there are there are organizations who've just maybe never had the chance or the opportunity, or were actually invited to talk with the transit agency about solutions or about working on projects. So I think, board members often can open doors, Christoph said, or start conversations that is hard for the agency to do, or the agency just doesn't have the ability, and maybe ability is wrong, but the agency either, it's not a priority, or they just don't have the connection. So I think this is an area where a diverse board and a board that's connected with the community can be really helpful, and a board members specifically.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If I could, I would love to go back to a theme I heard in your opening statements from Kathy, from Ozzy, and from Doug. Just reflecting back to this idea that this is such an impactful moment in time to be in transportation. Where do we want to go as thought leaders? And I think, how do we, again, kind of picking up on your theme there, Kathy, I've been thinking a lot about how do we as board members of transit agencies need to respond to the calls for racial justice and racial equity. Like, what does that really look like? And I mean that sort of like from the very broad to also just the very nuts and bolts of how do we stage conversations at our meetings? Like, should we be inviting in racial equity and racial justice leaders to present to the board and not just staff members? I think all the time, like, we're meeting on Zoom. Anybody in the world could address the SFMTA board now just as easily as anybody else, right? And like, should we be more intentional about staging those conversations? So I'd love to just raise those themes again and hear if you have any reflections on those kinds of ideas.
Ozzy, you had your hand up.
I did. I will lower it now. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's good to think about the big picture. I wrote a couple notes along the way. First of all, thank you to everybody, Fred, Neil, Christoph, David, for presenting. There was a lot of really insightful perspectives, and what a rare luxury to hear from folks that have been through this process, to share how much, navigating all these things are some things we all as individual board members here at TriMet are grappling with every day. There's a couple of things that stood out to me, and they're really, since we're in discussion, I don't really have a specific question for an individual, but these are questions that came to mind as I was listening to your presentations. There's one about how we as a board build that rapport when, David, you spoke about getting to four and that sort of concept. There's a tension between the opportunities to build rapport, have conversations, the opportunities to even see each other outside of meetings are very limited. And there's a tension around the public disclosure rules that really prevent us from even having casual time in more than one or two people. So it really leaves a lot of it's quite, I don't know, it feels contained. It feels a little bit forced to not be able to have those opportunities to talk. So I don't know how to navigate that. So that was one thought that came to me. I was really intrigued by Christoph's mention of the board members coming out to present to the community. So I'm really curious to digging deeper into when that makes sense to do it, and how does the agency properly tap board members so that we're not meddling in something either too early, too late, or not properly informed. That was an intriguing concept to me that I don't feel like I've certainly figured out. And then there's the nuts and bolts of how we kind of play with others. The interagency coordination is a question that drives me nuts, and I didn't hear much about it in all the great perspectives today. But here we have other regional agency governments. As David mentioned, we have Metro, which is very similarly located and structured, although they are an elected member body and we are an appointed. So how do we, as appointed board members, interact with elected board officers that are also having conversations within the region that are impacting the public services of transit? Right now, that's a big question on my mind, because we have the example of the Rose Lane project, which is a fantastic initiative at the city level. Would have been even more fantastic to have been engaged in that more early on as a transit agency, because it impacted us quite a bit in a good way. But boy, it would have been great not to find out in the papers the same time everyone else did. Those kind of examples lead me to how would you point us in the right direction towards addressing those? And then last one was service planning. I just don't quite know how we put ourselves into the service planning conversation, because that's a multi-year, multi-phase. It has already gone through generations of stakeholder input, but then there's like the frontline reality the public sees today. So when they see an expansion here, they ask, why not over there? And there might be this really long bureaucratic answer to that, but I'm not sure how to properly input that feedback in the right place in the process. So that's where my brain was going. And yeah, this is all going back, Amanda, to really how do we make the most of this meaningful impact potential? So that's what my thoughts are.
This is good. I think, David, you want to help us move on to your the next part of this, but I just wanted to say that yeah, this is really good information. And I'll point out for the folks that aren't in the Portland area here is that TriMet is right now doing a pretty comprehensive and big look at our safety, security, and equity programs. And we're going to have a large discussion next week in another little session with the board how we are doing with some of our programs. And then I think the things, Amanda, you have pointed out in terms of kind of the three parts, the relentless pursuit of common ground, kind of having the goals and objectives pretty clear, but then having a process that maybe brings back some of the options to the board for discussion and dialogue, may be a good model for how we actually move this forward. So hopefully we can talk about that a bit next week, because I think I heard some good things here that might help us all be better in the outcome and better accepted by folks in the outcome when we get done. So that's my 2 cents on this one, Amanda. So thank you for your suggestions and thoughts.
I think we can continue this in smaller groups. This is such a rich conversation, and we set up some small breakouts, which was the idea for the format on Zoom. So should we proceed to do that, or?
Well, let's just see. So again, the idea of this breakout was to take specific topics and talk about them. David, is that what you were thinking?
No, I think it was the desire that was expressed to us, because we just set it up in response to the request, was the ability to have some smaller group discussion.
Okay.
And so Fred and Amanda will be in one room, Christoph will be in one room, I'll be in, and then it will switch around. Yeah.
All right. So how's the board feeling? You want to keep this dialogue going, or you want to break into smaller groups?
Ozzy here. What's the tail end of this? Because I imagine if we break up into smaller groups, I'd like to know, is there a convening at the end? Is there homework? Do we have to come up with top 3 or something before we leave, I guess? So what am I answering yes to?
Well, your answer, I think the answer is, would you like to have just a little more time with one of the speakers to talk about some issue? And then I think whether we have, I hadn't thought about just getting back together afterwards, but maybe we can just have, we can debrief with our presenters and see if there's something they heard relay rather than taking a lot more time today, is because I think we've taken enough of your time this week for TriMet activities.
Bruce, if I may, how much time was allotted for this portion?
Well, it was about half an hour, I believe.
Well, can we do 10 minutes? Try to do 10 minutes on each. If we have 3 areas of concern, can we, or 3 topics that we want to discuss, can we do 10 minutes on each one and cut it off and say, you know, and do it that way? Because I guess I would like to have the whole group in on each area or topic of discussion.
Yeah.
What do you think? Is that, David, is that technologically something we can do, you think?
Yeah, we can do, this is all to suit you. So whatever, you know, whatever you wanted to do, but your staff had communicated that it might be helpful to have smaller groups to go deeper on some of these things and then switch around. And then it does, Zoom does come back out to the whole group at the end.
Okay.
Really. Yeah. So I have a colleague who's standing by on Zoom and we can make anything happen. If you say 10 minutes, she'll do it for 10 minutes. If you, we think we told her 15, but it's flexible. It's all to suit you, really.
David, can I get a new coach for the 49ers?
I just do baseball, man. I don't know football.
Bruce, I just one comment, just administratively, knowing the full board is convened. Remember, there's that group of 4 and 3 or less. Otherwise, it's still a public forum, so that may alter the conversation. So I just private, I think is the intent. So I just leave that there for you.
That was my recollection too. Was about that you can have more candid. That was true with us at Metro County. You can have more candid conversations among groups of 2 or 3.
Yes. Well, that's good. We need, so can we pick a person and arrange ourselves to different groups? Assign
yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Leave this meeting and log into the other invitation. Is that how that works?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And yes, and I have a colleague who's waiting on that other one, who then, you know, she's got the list, and you can't talk as a group of 7. You have to go into the groups, as my understanding of, you know, in terms of.
We'll exit this and come into a new one.
Okay.
And we, I guess I'm looking at who wants to talk with Amanda.
Well, but
I'm trying to figure out how to get.
But you can't have more than 4 talking to her at once.
That's exactly right. So I was looking at if we could limit it.
We've set up a rotation that will happen.
Oh, you have? Okay, never mind. Then I'll go out and follow your lead. So I'm going out.
Okay. See you on the other side.